Good evening. So before we begin the talk tonight, I would like to read our land acknowledgement statement, and we'll take a few minutes afterwards to think about the words in this text and what we can do as stewards of this land to further the mission. Yes. I don't know if this is on, but I will project. So before we begin tonight, we will be reading the land acknowledgement statement for Luther College, and I would like us afterwards to take a minute to think about the words in this statement and what we can do as stewards of this land to further the mission of the land acknowledgement. Take my mask off. Yes, all right. Okay. The land on which Luther College stands has been home to the Iowa, Sac, Fox, and Dakota people and their ancestors. As part of the neutral ground created by the US government to control the movement, lives, and livelihood of Native peoples, this land was home to the Winnebago Ho-Chunk during their forced displacement from Wisconsin. The dispossession of the Iowa, Sac, Fox, and Dakota and the forced migration of the Winnebago Ho-Chunk people was motivated by the interests of settlers such as those who founded this town and this college. The Winnebago, during their residence here, addressed the land as grandmother. The tribe's orator, Wakanda Kora, believed his people were extended the blessing of this place by the Great Spirit, saying, "We did not make it, nor could we make it so pretty and fair a land. Please honor this history and the ongoing connection of the descendants of these early residents to this place. Please also honor and care for the land, water, and resources as these residents did, like a loved and loving elder to whom we owe our life." Thank you. Now I'd love to introduce Brenda J. Child. She is Northrop professor and former chair of departments of American Studies and American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota. She's a past president of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. In 2021, she was the University of Minnesota's recipient of the President's Community Engaged Scholar Award. Child holds a PhD in history and is the author of several award-winning books, including Boarding School Seasons, American Indian Families, 1900 to 1940, Holding Our World Together, Ojibwe Women and the Survival of Community, and My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks, Ojibwe Family Life and Labor on the Reservations. The last book won the American Indian Book Award. Her new book project, The Marriage Blanket, Love, Violence, and the Law in Indian Country, is a historical study of domestic violence, disenrollment, and changes in family life. Child scholarship focuses on gender, labor, and family life in the Great Lakes and the history of Indigenous education. She is married to the Middlesex Ojibwe artist Stephen Kreml, and they live with their family in St. Paul and Bemidji, Minnesota. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brenda J. Child.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your patience at letting us get set up here, because what I'm going to talk about tonight is very visual, so I really wouldn't want you to miss any of the interesting pictures. So I would say one part of my resume that isn't mentioned here is that I began and sort of ended my education in the state of Iowa. Even though I'm Red Lake Ojibwe from northern Minnesota, I have family kind of scattered across the Midwest. But when I was a little girl and went to kindergarten, my father was a high school English teacher and a basketball coach in DeWitt, Iowa. So I went to kindergarten in DeWitt, and that was the end for a very long time of my sojourn in Iowa until I went and got my PhD in Iowa City at the University of Iowa. So I do have a long kind of connection to this region, and even though I haven't spent time at Luther College, my first teaching job was just 1 year, kind of like my kindergarten thing, but just 1 year when I actually started my teaching career at Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. So I was at a kind of college quite similar to Luther, and that was before I went on and went and lived in big cities and taught at big universities. And even though I spent a lot of my career doing that, I still consider myself a person from small places, from small towns. And I feel very comfortable when I'm in smaller towns and places. So thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here, and I always think thanks for Novia in particular for being patient with my schedule, because everything gets bottled up at this time of the year. There's so many things going on in March and April, and then then school's out and life kind of resumes again. But I have had a really busy, very busy month. And, but I'm really happy to be with you and be able to present some of my work on the history of Ojibwe women. And in particular, what I'm going to talk about this evening is the jingle dress dance. And you may not know anything about the jingle dress dance, but if you've ever been to a powwow, and even the University of Iowa powwow that they have, I don't know if they still do it every year. It kind of started when I was in grad school, and I know it went on for many years. But if you've ever been to a powwow, even in Meskwaki or someplace around the Midwest, you have probably seen women performing the jingle dress dance. And one of the things that's quite interesting to me about the jingle dress dance tradition, I've been talking about it and writing about it for a long time, but people became very interested in it the last 2 years because it originated in the last global pandemic. And it is a dance and a tradition about healing. And so I think all of us, I was, historian, always telling people about the influenza of 1918 to 1920, and people are, oh yeah, whatever, that happened a long time ago, nothing like that would ever happen again. But here we are, right? Here we are in hopefully coming on the end of, what happened a century ago. And what I think is so interesting about this is that even in some of our, I think what we've learned too is that things might start out in New York City, right? But eventually these epidemics reach into every corner, right? And there's hardly any place that is not affected by them. And that's something that we've all come to really, I think, learn about. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit tonight then about the last global pandemic in 1918-20 that happened in several waves, right, of this terrible illness. And one of the things I think is kind of one of the lessons of the jingle dress dance tradition is here we are experiencing this pandemic, and I think we all try to make sense of it in our own way. What does it all mean? Why is it happening? What are going to be the consequences? And I think in a sense, we know what we've sort of been through and what we've experienced ourselves, but we don't necessarily know at this point what the consequences will be. And some of those will be bad, right? People who've lost loved ones and family members, it's especially tragic for. But I also think there's just part of this that is kind of the unknown, because people are very creative and they're very loving and they're very generous, right? And I think this is what the jingle dress is all about. It's about a tradition of healing that first emerged a century ago. So I'd like to tell you a little bit more about it. And my talk, the reason why I kind of kept going on the jingle dress, I've written this book called My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks. I'd written a chapter about healing in a book about Ojibwe labor. And I talked about the jingle dress dance. And once you finish a book, you kind of think, okay, I'm moving on to my next thing. But somehow this has just sort of stayed with me, just like the boarding school stuff has kind of stayed with me because there remains public interest in it. But one of the things I was really super proud of in my life is that in the spring of 2019, I had been working with my students at the University of Minnesota and actually had the foresight and organizational skills, which I don't always have, to organize an exhibit about the jingle dress dance tradition. And we opened it at the Mille Lacs Tribal Museum. I'm gesturing toward my husband because he's a Mille Lacs tribal member. And they have a beautiful museum on the lake in their community. But Mille Lacs is also the place that is kind of said to be one of the origin sites of the jingle dress dance tradition. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if on the anniversary of the global pandemic that we had an exhibit at Mille Lacs about the history of the jingle dress, because I think a lot of people in the community, they know the stories about the jingle dress and they know it's about healing, but they don't necessarily place it with this pandemic of a century ago in the way that I kind of came to place it in that particular moment. So this all opened up, in the spring of 2019. We had a wonderful opening. It was, I think very appreciated by the community. We showed historic dresses through the decades, which were kind of fun to look at. And then the next year came the pandemic, and I was thinking, gosh darn, I have the only, one of the few exhibits in the United States about the pandemic of 1918, 1920. And yet we had to close the museum down, right? So it was kind of like the good and the bad all together with that. But it reopened eventually, and it just took it down this past winter. So it's been, it's had a nice run at the museum. But the funny thing that I wasn't anticipating is that people in New York would call me, writers in, the CBC in Canada, and everyone wanted to know about the jingle dress when we were kind of locked down during those few months. And so I was talking to people all over the US and Canada about the jingle dress dance tradition. So that was fun. And one of the great things that happened during this time is that the Star Tribune, which is our big newspaper in Minneapolis, asked me to write last year, they call it the Christmas essay. It's not an essay about Christmas necessarily. It can be about anything on your mind, right? But they asked kind of local writers from Minnesota to write an essay, and they say it can be about anything. So of course, here we were still in the middle of the pandemic a year ago, right? Right before vaccines came, and we were in the thick of everything, and they asked me to write this essay. So this is what I'm going to talk to you about, what I decided to write about for the newspaper. And I'll start out with a photograph from my home community in northern Minnesota, which is Red Lake, Minnesota. And as I was mentioning to Novian at dinner, we have somewhat of an unusual history at Red Lake, because even though we negotiated one big treaty in 1863 and ceded a large portion of land all the way over into North Dakota. So if you think way northern Minnesota in the central part of the state, that's where Red Lake is. We have one of the largest freshwater lakes in the country. And we ceded this land in a treaty when things weren't going so well for Indians in Minnesota in the early 1860s. And so our leaders decided, we had to do this. So we made that negotiation. But then afterward, we were kind of fortunate in that we held on to our land. And we didn't take part in, first of all, the allotment of Indian reservations, which was devastating to tribes. And we ended up kind of holding on to that land base. And we think, we're very proud of that fact at Red Lake, that our 19th century leaders were very steadfast in opposing the allotment, which means moving to private ownership of property. And so at Red Lake today, we still all own the whole thing all together. And we think it's a very special place in the Great Lakes. So the Red Lake Reservation, this is a photograph from probably the first decade of the jingle dress dance tradition, once it emerged there. So the jingle dress dance is an Ojibwe tradition that's now a century old. And it's evolved to become part of the social life and the ritual of powwows. But other kinds of dances, like the big drum ceremonies in Minnesota and Wisconsin, which are really interesting community events. Again, my husband's family is very involved in this aspect of Ojibwe ceremonial life. The jingle dress dance is indigenous to Ojibwe people of both the US and Canada. And it also became a Dakota tradition early on. And the Dakota are some of our closest neighbors in Minnesota, as well as up in Manitoba, where a lot of Dakota people fled after the 1862 war in Minnesota. In recent decades, since the 1980s in particular, it began to be widely adopted by other Indigenous women. Isn't that interesting? So it's kind of like a regional tradition in the Great Lakes and among the Dakota, our closest neighbors, for decades and decades and decades. And then when I was a young girl, and people were making me my first powwow dress in the 70s on the reservation, and I was a young teenager, I wanted a buckskin dress with long fringe, because my grandma had a jingle dress. And when you're that age, you're not always wise enough to just do what your grandma does. And we'd all be better if we had done that, right? But I wanted a different kind of dress. And in fact, the tradition may have looked like it was even on its way out, because it was primarily, I thought, being practiced by older women in our community. So interesting then, something happened in the 1980s that it didn't die out, but it made this great leap and became kind of a pan-Indian. Now they're Navajo jingle dress dancers, right? Indians from Washington State. And so it's just spread throughout the United States and pretty much all of the Indian country in the US and Canada. So the jingle dress dance tradition, I suggest to you, is about healing the body, but it's also about healing the mind, right? And we know that in big cataclysmic events like this, that we need to heal the body, but also the mind, especially the aftermath of grief. And in that sense, I always say, it is profoundly about love for your relatives and your community, and even those who have left this world. And in this time of loss, perhaps more than any other time in our lives, we better understand the suffering of people who survived the pandemic of 1918, 1920, which was also deeply felt in Ojibwe country. And the other thing about this pandemic, if you've been reading about it and that kind of epidemiology of it and all that, is that the pandemic a century ago is somewhat different than the one we're now experiencing, because it has been most devastating to older people, right? A century ago, that particular influenza was deadly to young people. So imagine if this epidemic was similar, and imagine how traumatic that was, that so many people lost children, people, college-age students, right? People in the prime of their lives died in this epidemic a century ago. So the Ojibwe jingle dress dance was once a new tradition, and it has endured, and I think it's evolved to fit the needs of people over time. My grandmother, that I already mentioned, Jeanette Ogana, was a jingle dress dancer pretty much all of her life. Even when she was an older woman, she was a jingle dress dancer. And I thought, in recent years, how she would have been a teenager at the time of this pandemic a century ago. In the Great Lakes, which is the home of 200,000 Ojibwe people, right? So we're one of the bigger tribes, not just in the Midwest, but kind of half of us live on the US side, and our other relatives live in Canada, right? What's now Canada. So we're kind of divided by this international border, but kind of equally on both sides. And we consider ourselves, Ojibwe people. Steve and I are Ojibwe, but there are other Anishinaabe people, of which the Ojibwe are part of this larger grouping in the Great Lakes of the United States and Canada. And there are tribes that are kind of closely related to us who also call themselves Anishinaabe. So I'm interested in this tradition as an Ojibwe woman who never was a jingle dress dancer, but also I'm interested in it as a historian. And it's kind of fascinating to me that the influenza pandemic has such a strong, what historians call historical memory. And I've been kind of intrigued by this idea of historical memory in relationship to the jingle dress dance, because American historians like to say, oh, that pandemic, and this was before the recent one, when we became more familiar with the global pandemic a century ago. Historians used to say, oh, that epidemic was terrible a century ago, but people wanted to just move on and forget about it when it was over. And even though more people died in the pandemic than died in World War I, it still was something that they say, we don't have a strong historical memory of it in the United States. And I like to say, except for American Indians, because every time this jingle dress dance is performed, we are remembering the worldwide epidemic of influenza that spread in these, I think, I used to say 3, but now the main historian of the pandemic has said how devastating it was in 1920, and we've been calling it 1918, 1919. But anyway, it killed, kind of like what we're going through now, 30 to 50 million people worldwide. And in the US, 670,000 people died. And of course, with this pandemic now, we have exceeded that number. But it used to always sound like a lot to me. It is a lot, right? I was still reading, even though things have improved so much, how many people died last week in Minnesota, right? It was like 68 people, right? It's a lot of people to die in a pandemic. So, so it was spreading this, not just the influenza, but this tradition in the aftermath of the epidemic spread. And one of the places that it landed was among, and this is my point about even the most isolated places in the Great Lakes. And so this is a little shot that I took on my iPhone the first summer, like late in the summer after, the lockdown and all that. And I invited a friend, this isn't his work, but I invited a friend, I'll show you some of his photographs, to come out to Minnesota, a photographer from the Southwest, to kind of document what we were experiencing, right? Because if this had been the place where the jingle dress originated during that last global epidemic, I wanted to kind of see what was going on and with Ojibwe people a century later. This place is called Bear Island, and it's up on the Leech Lake Reservation, and it's kind of a lot of effort to get out there. And so that's why I say even the remote places, like when we went out there a year ago this past, 2 years ago this summer, when we went out to Bear Island and took these photographs, we had to contact a friend of ours who contacted a friend of hers who had a pontoon boat, right? And we went out to Bear Island. And the reason why I was interested in Bear Island is because I knew from the work of this ethnologist, ethnobotanist who worked at the Milwaukee Public Museum at the time of this pandemic a century ago. He'd written a little bit about the epidemic reaching Bear Island. And he was there to kind of document, he was interested in studying American Indian ethnobotany, medicine, plants and healing and that sort of thing. So the influenza pandemic reached Sugar Point, which is the mainland. They call this little area across from Bear Island, the mainland there, Sugar Point. And the influenza reached, it appears, Sugar Point and Bear Island in 1919. So this is a pretty far out there place, right? It's a little hard to get to now, somewhat remote, but imagine a century ago what it was like. And it was the homeland of numerous bands of Ojibwe. So the pandemic ends, and by 1924, 5 years later, with the pandemic behind them, an ethnobotanist from the Milwaukee Public Museum arrived on the island for research about Ojibwe knowledge of plants and medicine. I always like his name. He had a very cool name. It was Huron Smith. That's a good, cool name, isn't it? So he kept his field notes, which are still, you can still see at the Milwaukee Public Museum. And he said this, and I read this years ago, right, before I kind of knew about the jingle dress dance, or maybe I was just starting to figure, I always knew about the jingle dress dance. This connection to the pandemic is what I didn't know. And he said in his field notes, the Ojibwe could not successfully fight the influenza attack of 1919, and the present population consists of only 14 persons, right? So, chilling. He went on to enumerate the survivors. They included a man named, he calls him White Cloud, his wife, their son. So he's saying in his field notes, who's left alive. I think this was his second trip, right? And he's talking about, wow, there's been this devastation. So for a month in the summer of 1924, Smith would study with and photograph the elders who were spared. The elders, right? He took pictures of really old, elderly people. There was a woman who said, she's almost 100 years old. The elders were still alive, and the young people in the prime of their lives had died. So Smith would study with and photograph the elders who were spared and still lived on Bear Island, including a man, John Paper's mother. She was the one almost 100. And then this was John Paper's wife. And I think it's kind of a beautiful picture of these daughters, because it's really a story of population recovery and survival, right? It's a lovely picture. You wouldn't have thought how terrible things would have been in their community a short time before. Before the pandemic, Bear Island was, I think, a kind of microcosm of the Ojibwe world. Yet the history of Bear Island, and this is something you probably don't hear so much in Iowa, but there's a real story associated with Bear Island having to do with conflict and warfare between Indians and non-Indians in Minnesota in the 1890s. And so the history of Bear Island has been kind of written as if every important event happened in the year of this conflict, which was 1898. 8 years after really the end of the Indian Wars in the US, right? This is 1898, is 8 years after the Battle of Wounded Knee in South Dakota. A very kind of small fight broke out on the Leech Lake Reservation between kind of a loose collection of Ojibwe men who were outnumbered, very outnumbered by US soldiers. And I always think, as often happens in these situations, Minnesotans overreacted. Bemidji residents, where I live up in Bemidji too, trembled, kind of huddled in the courthouse. They thought there was some kind of Indian uprising going on. While in St. Paul, they loaded a Gatling gun on a train headed for the nearest station to Leech Lake in the town of Walker, Minnesota. And at the end of a single day of fighting, 19 Ojibwe men allowed the 77 soldiers to withdraw with their numerous dead and wounded. Only one Ojibwe person was killed, and that was a policeman, an Indian policeman shot by kind of friendly fire. I often think about what was going on then in the late 1890s, the turn of the century in Minnesota, and places up north. And at this time, I was talking to my students about this week. Minnesota was developing kind of a vision for hunting, regulating hunting and fishing in the state. And what people sort of decided is that these are now going to be not subsistence activities for American Indians, right, who made a living from hunting deer and harvesting and all these things. They were to be activities now for recreation with seasonal limitations. And Ojibwe men and women were criminalized and incarcerated at the turn of the century here in the Midwest, in places like Wisconsin and Minnesota, for their work of hunting and fishing. So activities you used to get recognition for, right? You're providing for your family, are now considered criminal activities, disregarding treaty rights and negotiations, where Native people were usually very careful to spell out they reserved the right to hunt, to fish, and gather, because they knew they couldn't make a living on land they were, that they had to negotiate and would be going to the government. Also, I was just hearing that you have a distinguished microbrewery here in Decorah. And this was, so also in the late 19th century, distilleries were opening up in the Midwest, and immigrants were brewing beer and that kind of thing. And it was illegal, though, to sell alcohol on reservations, which was another kind of itchy situation, right? So if Native people were drinking beer, they were criminals, right? They couldn't have a beer or whatever because it was illegal to sell beer. So this was another source of problem. There was a man from Leech Lake named, we call him Buganagishick, his translates as hole in the day, had been arrested on weed charges, and he was taken to Duluth. And I don't know what it was, hunting out of season, drinking beer, something. He was sent to Duluth and then released from jail. And this was what was happening all over Indian country and the Midwest. He had to walk all the way back to Leech Lake, where he was from, after his release. He was 60 years old, and it was a long trip by foot, right? So this is kind of like what's preceding this weird conflict at Bear Island. Authorities tried to come in and arrest Bugginagishik in the fall. It led to a struggle. Ojibwe people hoped to protect him because he was a spiritual leader in the community. So Bugginagishik, who was never in the fight itself in 1898, instead, I always like this shirt of his, or whatever it is, he collected the spent cartridge casings and strung them into an elaborate necklace to remember the event, right? Commemoration, you know. He would live for another 20 more years until 1918. There's some, you know, in the jingle dress, I always think this picture is interesting because Indians like to hang tinkly things, right, from their clothing. But there wasn't really anything exactly like a jingle dress until after this global pandemic. Well, around the time Bugginagishik dies as an older man, it was the beginning of a global pandemic so invasive that it would reach even remote Bear Island in the following year. So in Minnesota, they call this the Battle of Sugar Point. And I always think it's, gosh, not so much a story about Indians, it's a Minnesota story, right? The Battle of Sugar Point. But I think, and this is what I decided to do with that essay in the Star Tribune, I have to acknowledge the Battle of Sugar Point. That's what all Minnesotans know about Sugar Point and Bear Island. But I said, let's just set that whole story aside and rewrite the history of Bear Island to include women, right? To include Ojibwe women. What if the clatter of cartridge casings became the healing sound of jingle dresses? And the influenza pandemic is part of this story, along with suffering and depopulation, but it's also a story of survival. Bear Island was a place where Ojibwe people went in the springtime to prepare their gardens and gather medicines and plants for tea. And sometime during the pandemic and its aftermath, women created a medicine dress, a revolutionary new tradition of healing that appears to have surfaced simultaneously in Ojibwe communities of both the United States and Canada, the jingle dress dance. So at Mille Lacs, where Steve is from, you name the woman, the little girl who became, they tell a story of a little girl who became very ill, near death. Her father had a dream to save her life, and he dreamt of this special new jingle dress. He asked his wife to make it. They went off to the ceremonial drum that weekend, and the little girl was lying on the side because she was too sick. And before the evening was over, and the women were dancing in this new dress, she got up and danced and survived. So even though there were other jingle dress dancers there, I like to think of the first jingle dress dancer as being a little girl. Now, the interesting thing about this lovely story, which Steve has heard all his life, and I have heard for most of my life, up in Whitefish Bay, Ontario, which is really far up north in Canada, they tell exactly the same story. And they name the girl. And her name is Maggie White up there. And her descendants, we've talked with her descendants. Maggie White's great-granddaughter, who's a jingle dress dancer today. We saw her at the Powwow Red Lake last summer. And she said, we wanted to take pictures of jingle dress dancers. And she said, I'm Maggie White's granddaughter. We thought, oh, that's so cool, right? So simultaneously, and Ojibwe people have no trouble with this idea that it emerged in simultaneously. Because why would, if this comes from divine things, why would it emerge in one place? Why wouldn't it be in many places at once? So this is what happened in 1918-19. So as I was saying about Bear Island, this was, let's set aside, in a sense, this story of Sugar Point. Tell the story of Bear Island. Let the clatter of cartridge casings become the healing sounds of jingle dresses. But the story is also, of course, about suffering and depopulation, but also survival. Bear Island was a place where Ojibwe people went in the springtime to prepare their gardens, gather medicines, and then this new tradition emerges, the jingle dress dance. Bear Island flint corn, which we still grow in northern Minnesota, wild rice, and the deep indigenous knowledge of the island's abundant plants and medicines, I think, should shape a new narrative. They were fundamental to Ojibwe health and persistence. And I think let's rearrange the main characters on Bear Island and move away from military men and fighters to refocus on women. And then I think, why not give them beautiful names? And we can begin with Ellen Red Blanket. Huron Smith didn't call her Ellen Red Blanket. He called her Mrs. White Cloud because her husband was White Cloud. Oh, this is just the flint corn, the harvesting of rice, and something the Ojibwe people love in this big pile called swamp tea. So Ellen Red Blanket was born around 1870, the daughter of Red Blanket, a hereditary chief at Leech Lake. And her name was recorded as Ellen White Cloud in official records because she was married to Wabashkanakud, or White Cloud. At this time, Ojibwe people were adopting surnames for legal reasons, right? School attendance, land allotments, and John White Cloud was recorded as age 69 in the census conducted at Bear Island in the spring of 1930. I always like to go look at census records. I kind of got a kick out of this one because the census taker, they'd list the whole household, right? White Cloud, Mrs. White Cloud, and they said John White Cloud was 69, which is probably accurate. But the census taker, Mrs. Ellen Red Blanket's age by a wide margin and recorded it at 44, when she was probably closer to 60 in 1930. And I always think, what would you do? Here you speak Ojibwe, some census taker comes around and wants to know how old you are, right? She was probably having some fun and saying, I'm just 44. Ellen Red Blanket spoke Ojibwe, as did everyone else at Bear Island. And the other thing I find interesting about the census is the bias about women and not understanding anything about women. Which was often in the census records. John White Cloud was, of course, listed as the head of the household and a farmer. But I find that so interesting because in Red Blanket's time, women pretty much controlled the economic lives within their communities. And for the Ojibwe, water in particular was a gendered space where women had what you might call property rights. And they managed and performed most of the labor in, for example, the wild rice harvest. But it was very hard for outsiders at this period of time to see Ojibwe women for what they were, which was fisher women, harvesters of wild rice, agriculturalists, and healers. Because women like Ellen Red Blanket were experts at gathering wild plants. And Bear Island was her medicine garden. And the census taker recorded her occupation as nun. Ojibwe people have a philosophy of a good life, one that Ellen Red Blanket and John White Cloud would have called Wenjibe Mataziyane. Ojibwe leaders evoke this idea, which kind of translates as from what or where we get our living our life. They constantly repeated this idea in treaty negotiations to secure land and all the necessities of life for their economic survival, but also just to continue to lead a meaningful life. This idea was a philosophy, a prayer, but I also think of it as a very profound Ojibwe legal concept as well. Ellen Red Blanket and John White Cloud lived on Bear Island half the year, as it was where they got their living. Their necessities of garden vegetables, wild rice, berries, and medicine. They planted gardens in the spring, they harvested wild rice in late summer, and they hunted deer on the island. Women made and repaired fishing nets by hand. That was one of the specializations of Ojibwe women. They made fishing nets. And leash lake fishing has always been pretty amazing. But fully stocked for winter, they moved back to Sugar Point and to the mainland and to their Ojibwe relatives. So the island was the place where they went in the spring, the summer, into the fall, and then they would make their way back to the mainland. Now, I find Huron-Smith really a very smart man. I think he enjoyed coming to Bear Island very much. And for an ethnobotanist, kind of obsessed, right, with knowing about Ojibwe ideas of healing and medicine, he completely missed the part that the jingle dress now played in healing, despite his fascination with Ojibwe plants and medicine. But for the Ojibwe, plants and medicine go together, right? They coexist in a kind of symbiotic partnership with song and dance, right? So this is all healing. It's not just taking the medicine, harvesting the plants, but it goes together in a cultural way with song and dance, right? Which is art, right? And we know very therapeutic. In the Ojibwe world at Bear Island, spiritual power in Ojibwe ways of thinking of the world moves through air. And because of that, sounds hold great significance. And so you can see from her dress, it's the metal cones that are what make a jingle dress and produce its incredible sound. Smith photographed Ellen Red Blanket in her jingle dress, but with absolutely no mention in his field notes of a new healing tradition that swept Ojibwe communities across the Great Lakes of the United States and Canada, and no mention of the dress itself. But she wanted to be photographed in her jingle dress, right, that she had made herself. And because I can date this because of the ethnobotanist records, I kind of think of it as the earliest photograph that we can easily date of an Ojibwe woman in a jingle dress. That doesn't mean it's the first one, it's just the one I can easily date. So this is Ellen Red Blanket's dress. And let's take a look at it for a minute. It was, of course, made by hand. There's a row of jingles at the shoulder yoke, 3 more rows on the skirt, and in this very dignified portrait, she poses for the best look at her dress, right? She's very, very, very proud of it. The eye can kind of take in every angle and detail of her ribbon work. Her jingles, so each of these metal cones are made by hand, and they're perfect. Even her sleeves are adorned with rows of ribbons, large sequins, and jingles. Probably in her mid-50s at the time of this picture, Red Blanket's hair is still black and held in place with a headband across her forehead. The texture of her dress makes it likely that it was made of black cotton velveteen, which Ojibwe people prefer as a fabric for dresses and for beadwork. The old style jingles from this era have a tighter roll and can be sewn closely together on a dress, My husband says that he made a lot of these as a child with his mother. Hers might be made of tobacco cans or the tins from other household items, even baking soda cans. We found a lot of materials when we were working on our exhibit with the historic dresses. With so many jingles close together, the old style jingle dresses produced a deeper resonance than those with later a favored, this is what my grandmother used, Copenhagen tobacco lids, which were rolled more loosely in later decades. So from what we know, the jingle dress dance tradition in the Minnesota side of things began in the Mille Lacs region, spread to other communities, and within a short time was adopted by the Dakota. The jingle dress dance was widespread in Canada with an origin there around Whitefish Bay, Ontario. Decades later, in the 1980s, these are Dakota women in their jingle dresses. The healing tradition spread among many tribal nations on powwow circuits across North America. Jingle dress dancers in 2016 and 17 assembled at Standing Rock to protest the pipeline project. And today, the 200,000 Ojibwe people of the US and Canada remember this pandemic a century ago in stories, song, and dance. And it is a healing tradition that is now over a century old. When the Chippewa National Forest was established, over 85% of the Leech Lake Reservation, which was finalized in 1928, the injustice to the people who lived there was staggering. Ojibwe allotments ended in the newly renamed Chippewa National Forest, and other signs appeared to even deter activities like Ojibwe berry picking. The National Forest status did not protect the land as the Ojibwe had, but rather the federal government exploited and profited from excessive timber sales in this national forest. One Ojibwe leader from Leech Lake explained what it felt like to live on 15% of their former reservation when he said, "We are hardly able to breathe." Ellen Red Blanket and John Whitecloud survived the influenza at Bear Island, and Huron Smith noted their son survived as well. But Red Blanket also had an adult daughter, Grace. And 2 years after the pandemic, Grace's daughter, Daisy Johnson, so spelled Daisy with an S, S-Y, was born on Bear Island on June 23rd, 1921. And when we went out to Bear Island, August, during the pandemic, we asked that Red Blanket's descendants come out if they were interested in talking to us. Marlene Johnson Mitchell of Longville, Minnesota, is Grace's granddaughter, that baby born on Bear Island, and Ellen Red Blanket's great-granddaughter. She studied business management at Bemidji State University and spent her career working as the director of housing for her tribe at Red Lake, or at Leech Lake, though now she's retired. So in August, 2 years ago, this coming August, and during another global pandemic, Mitchell joined an outing my friends and I had organized to Bear Island. And it was a beautiful, cool evening in August, and we wanted to enjoy the last days of summer and take photographs. And I said I convinced this colleague who'd taken that photograph at Standing Rock, who's a Navajo photographer, to come out to Minnesota. And his daughters are in the back row, and they're all, 2 of them are his daughters, 2 of their friends. They're all Navajos and jingle dress dancers from, they live in Utah, and they're jingle dress dancers. So we brought along more jingle dress dancers. These 2 little girls in front are family friends from Red Lake. And at that time, trying to keep our social distance in the summer, the White family from Sugar Point, Ryan and his dad, Ron, took us out on their pontoon boat. And it was such a beautiful evening when we finally got out there. I noticed shorebirds I rarely see in more populated areas of northern Minnesota. And Ron White kind of motored around the island so we could observe the stands of ripening wild rice, almost ready for harvest. Mitchell brought along her granddaughter, Daisy, Z with a Z, Daisy Johnson, just 19 years old, after I suggested we photograph her in a jingle dress on the island. Daisy is the great-granddaughter of Red Blanket's granddaughter, Daisy with an S, one of the first Ojibwe born on the island after the pandemic. And for us, the Bear Island visit was sort of a tribute to the Ojibwe survivors of the pandemic a century ago, our ancestors who created the jingle dress dance tradition. I learned from her family and folks at Leech Lake that Ellen Red Blanket lived a long life, and Mitchell had strong memories of her great-grandmother's stories. She said their horses were the first to leave the mainland in the spring, and the White Cloud and Red Blanket family would simply follow them across the frozen lake. She told us their entire family was born and raised near Bear Island. Mitchell smiled and laughed often, and we were eager to hear about her family's connections to this very special place. Her ancestors survived the first global pandemic in modern history, surely a tragic era, but most of all, Mitchell remembered Red Blanket's hopefulness and frequent words, "It was the best life." So, just to wrap this up, we took more photographs that summer. This is not far from where I live in St. Paul, and there's this family at the center with these beautiful beaded hats are the Mary Lyons in the center, her family from the Leech Lake Reservation, but who lived down in the cities in St. Paul. The one on the left with the beautiful vintage bandolier bag is my dear daughter, Benet, who is also a jingle dress dancer. So when the jingle dress dance was introduced, it was an innovation, but one consistent with Ojibwe spiritual traditions on traditions of song and dance. I also find it essential, just to wrap this up, as the jingle dress movement, as an anti-colonial movement, because the new practice organized and flourished in the early 1920s, which is when the Indian office in Washington banned ritualistic dancing on reservations. So I often think about this exact same historic moment, right? The Indian office is saying, no more powwows, no more ritualistic dances in the Southwest, and Native people are supposed to, abandon these pagan practices of the past. There was an infamous circular from the Office of Indian Affairs in the Department of Interior that was sent to reservations in the spring of 1921 with the following message: "The dance, however, under most primitive and pagan conditions, is apt to be harmful when found to be so among the Indians. We should control it by educational processes as far as possible, but if necessary, by punitive measures when its degrading tendencies persist." So that's the US take on our traditions. American Indians responded to the dance order. Letters to the Indian office multiplied. And I like especially these words from the San Ildefonso Pueblo in northern New Mexico, who said, the headman, "What?" That's how I'm going to start all my letters. "What?" he says. "Dance is our opera, our drama, our art." Anyway, regardless of these circulars from Washington, Ojibwe women in the United States, like Ellen Red Blanket, continue to spread the jingle dress dance tradition. So we outlasted the dance order of the early 1920s. And I made, if you ever want to look at our little documentary that we made at the University of Minnesota, when the pandemic began and I realized that all my colleagues across the country were going to be teaching remotely last year, and wanted perhaps to think about American Indian people and pandemics and our history, we made a little documentary, just 20 minutes long, it's free on YouTube, that we're kind of proud of. We think it's nice, and it shows our exhibit at Black's as well as talk about the tradition. And then what it means to Indian people today, because this lovely family here, Whitney, she's not related by blood, but I call her my niece, I love her so much. She was one of the survivors of the Red Lake High School shooting when she was 14 years old. And she talked about losing, imagine losing your best friends when you're 14 years old, and how she never wanted to go back to school, and she never went back to the high school. She eventually got her GED, and she's now a student at Bemidji State University. But she talks in the film about what it's meant to her in her own personal healing to be a jingle dress dancer. So we outlasted the dance order, and now the healing power of music is no longer a belief confined to Indigenous people of the US and Canada. The jingle dress did not disappear, but during the 1980s made a great leap as it evolved from a regional tradition, primarily practiced by small members of, elderly women like my grandmother, to a flourishing pan-tribal performance with a wide appeal across the generations. And it today maintains its integrity as a dance of healing. American Indian traditions of song and dance remain a powerful expression of cultural values. And the jingle dress, a gift of healing from the Ojibwe people, has adapted, survived, and continues to inspire Indigenous women and their communities. So I have all kinds of jingle dress projects I'll just briefly mention. We went out this past summer because a year ago there were no powwows, and everyone missed them so much. And so this summer there were more of a limited number of powwows, but I paired up with a woman who's from Sugar Point, out that area, a woman who's a self-taught photographer, and we went out and took portraits of women in their jingle dresses at powwows. And this is just an example of some of the pictures that we took at Mille Lacs this past summer. So I'm working on the jingle dress still, and one of the cool things that we're doing is we're doing an installation about the jingle dress at the Met in New York that opens in June, and it's just going to be an installation of two dresses, one a historic dress from our collection that was in the Mille Lacs Museum, black cotton velveteen with a cape kind of like this. And when the dress conservator said, like, you lift it up and you look at the cloth underneath, and it was a beautiful floral black calico, and they said that was probably from the 1890s that women reused cotton, right? You just didn't run down to the fabric store like you do now. And we're gonna pair that beautiful beaded dress with a contemporary one. And this one came to our house like 2 weeks ago in the mail. This is my daughter, Benet, and it's her jingle dress. And after it ends its little run at the Met, she's gonna wear it at powwows. And it's made of black cotton velveteen, but it's kind of machine applique in the way that is very popular right now. So it kind of speaks to that older dress, but yet it's very modern. We did use vintage jingles from an old dress we had in our house that someone had given me that was really super plain. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but we reused the jingle and we sent it up to our friend in near Thunder Bay, Ontario, who made this into the beautiful dress for my daughter, Benet. So it's a thriving tradition. And the other thing we're doing in addition to this exhibit at the Met that will open in June, and then we're gonna have a symposium at the Met in the fall. We don't have our date set for that yet. But I'm also working on an online exhibit about the jingle dress dance that we are hoping open at the National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian a year from now, which is Women's History Month. So we're praying that all comes together, and a lot has to do with the technology side of things because they haven't done a lot of online exhibits. But museum space tends to be booked out for years in advance, and theirs is booked up for the next 10 years. So we said, let's do an online exhibit. But I like the idea of that because I think it can be very, anyone, any place in the world can see it. You don't have to go to the museum in DC. And so we've been continuing to take photographs of Jingle dress dancers, my colleague Nadona Green and I, portraits, because we really want to show the vitality of the tradition today. Okay, so that's what's been up with the Jingle dress. Lots of things, but thank you very much to Liz for listening.
Thank you all for coming. We got started late and we finished late, and I know some of you have to run, but I know a lot of you have questions too, so I would like to make about 10 minutes worth of Q&A time. If there are those of you who have to leave, we understand. For those of you who do stick around, there's a small reception in Quality, and so we invite you to come and participate, but let's go ahead and I'll let you field the questions.
Okay, I'm open to questions if anyone has one. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question for you, and I apologize because it's going to be a long one.
Okay, go ahead. I'm long-winded, so I am tolerant.
Thank you, and I know you understand that. Thank you, and I apologize in advance. If anyone else has a question, please attend the reception. It's okay. I'd like to sit down and I'll stand. I want to say thank you so much for this lecture. I'm a biology and global health major, and I'm a senior, and I'm graduating in 7 weeks, and I have been spiritually on fire because I feel like I'm dying tomorrow, and that's just a metaphor because I'm graduating in 7 weeks, and when you live like you are dying tomorrow, you want to make the best of every day, and this is sort of the same for my culture as well. And so I logged in because it was mandatory that I attended this meeting. I'm going to be honest, but when I was on YouTube and I saw the title and the description of this talk today, I said I have to make it. I put on sweatpants and a beanie and I drove here and I sat down and you just gave me the most richest key for what I've been trying to solve my whole life. And my question for you is, as a child in the soils, as a child of the soils and the waters of Namibia, how do we restore the elders so that they can restore us? And this is in reference to the pandemic taking out our elders. Mm-hmm. And this pandemic is much more dangerous than the pandemics before us that have killed the youth. Because the youth have this very beautiful energy and gift of restoration that we can just replenish. If a child is lost, it is mourn, but we can always make more. Yeah. It's sort of the attitude that my culture has when it comes to children, because children are precious, but they are not limited, we can make more. My question, you cannot answer without this background, so please, patience with me. This is the mini speech or introduction I wrote for you to properly be able to answer me, because my history as a Namibian is so similar and parallel to what has happened to Native Americans here. I'm African, as I mentioned, I'm from Namibia, and our countries and the continent has been spiraling for centuries. Colonization is the biggest pandemic, and we're still feeling, even though it has stopped legally, it is still going on, it is killing our nation. So this is called the recipe for restoration. You must first tear down, and then you must build and start over. You must learn to start over. Culturally in Namibia, women are matriarchs in the family, and I see it too in this culture. These are the parallels I found. Women are the best leaders because men are good for fighting and defending, but not good for healing. They are good for hunting and strength, but not for restoration, because this is masculine energy. It is not the gender that they are referring to, but the energy instead. Women who possess both masculine and feminine energy and know the power of this balance were often made queens and chiefs in our tribes. Women in Namibia and in my tribe specifically are also agriculturalists. They are leaders, they are feeders. This feminine energy grows and the masculine energy breaks down. Neither of them are bad, but they are good in balance. Women in my culture are told to stay near the water, stay near the plants, because the water grows and heals, and we are made and taught to be therapeutic and make baskets and beautiful ornaments just like the ones you showed us today. This is what fosters and creates a healer and an oracle. Women who were especially neurodivergent, as you call it here, were actually called oracles. Oracles were wise from a very young age. Oracles were often identified as soon as 1 or 2 years old, and they were kept and trained in order to become the healers for the next generation. An oracle was as young as 1 year old, but as soon as she could speak, she would become the oracle of the tribe until her passing. So you'd have a healer who was as young as 2 years old if she learned how to speak. They often were able to tell if a child was an oracle if she spoke early, spoke quicker, wanted to learn things more. So I'm an oracle. I am neurodivergent as it is defined here, but I'm an oracle. The most powerful oracle I know from the stories told by my grandmother, my great-great-great-grandmother, that had the blessing to meet before she passed when I was 10. The greatest story she told me was of an oracle who was both queen and an oracle. By definition, in my tribe and my family's royal lineage, I'm an oracle, as I stated. This is not very organized, I did this in 5 minutes. They knew this about me from when I was a very young girl. My parents realized this when I was about 1 or 2 years old, when I told them I really, really want to go to school. And they knew I needed to start school immediately. Although my birth certificate states that I am 24, 25, I'm actually much younger. I found out this weekend. My mother used to say it is because I was attached to her for 2 years, and that this is the life force she poured into me from her mother, her great-grandmother, and so forth. And I forgot all of this. I forgot all of this, and I want you to help me to understand, how do I remember this again? How do women remember this again in my community? How do nations and natives of their countries remember this when their history is essentially erased? I told you I'm a biology major, but I took a history class last year, and we did a history of medicine, and we looked at many forms of medicine. And when we got to African medicine, I said, finally, I'm going to learn the piece that's always been missing, because I'm a healer, I'm an oracle, but I do not have my history. When it came to that portion, my very talented, very intelligent professor said, unfortunately, history by definition has to be recorded. And if you have a culture that passes stories down through art, through speaking, through training, you do not have a history. And that knocked me out, knocked the life force out of me, because essentially he told me I don't have elders, I don't have a past, I don't have anything. And I said I'll start from scratch. My parents sent me here to send me to Germany first, they sent me to the US, they said, we're gonna get you the best education because we don't know either. I used to ask them a whole bunch of, is God a woman or a man? They're like, oh my God, please go to school, I don't know. And that's why I believe education is the key. My father, we were not a family of means, but my father said I would sell all our cows and our property to make sure you go to school, the best schools in the world. And I'm in Luther College for a reason. This life force I'm talking about came through breast milk. That is just an analogy. The life force actually came through the bosom. And every time when I feel something, I touch here. And my mother said, you're just like my grandmother, because she was an oracle, she always did this. Whenever she feels something move in her spirit. And as you were talking, I don't know if you noticed, I was just like, oh. It is true, the Ojibwe dance and the dress is anti-colonial, because those laws were introduced during colonialism. and our histories were white. You are blessed, and your tribe and your peoples are blessed because you are a welcoming tribe. You allow the ethnobotanists and the anthropologists to write about your people. My tribe, our up north in Namibia, we are strong, very tough, angry people, especially when our loved ones are hurt. During Namibia's colonization, our did not allow any colonials to come to our tribes. We saw and heard what they did to the other tribes, especially the Oshiero. Please read the Namibian history for you to understand what I'm talking about. The Oshieros, there was a genocide where the Germans almost took out the entire tribe. We were up north and we heard about this. Yeah. And we made sure to fortify our fences. This is why our men were so important. They were good for defending, they were good for strength, but they were led by women. And women make the best leaders, and you cannot change my mind. Now my question for you, I hope, is now making a bit more sense. They also banned ritualistic practices. They killed my elders. They killed the natives of my people who I never met, but I feel pain listening to this because I know I'm an oracle and I'm an empath as well, so I feel the pain of my elders in my chest as you speak. The reason why I say COVID is the most dangerous pandemic in this world, because not even the US, who's quote unquote the best nation in the world, could fight this. In fact, they had the highest deaths in this country, in the world, I think, for a period of time. And this revealed something for me. I want to go home. I can't go home, but as a child of the Namibian waters and soil, I find myself here in the US and in the college. But if my elders are passing, that means that we're not talking to our elders. We're not learning from what makes us heal, especially not our grandmothers or aunties or women who are elders. So now that you have listened to my TED Talk, I would like you to answer my question. As a person who is foreign of this land, how do I find the Ojibwe dance for this community?
We were wondering what your question is.
What are the steps? How do we restore community and nations from the example you just taught us to?
Well, listening, I thought there were so many things I was going to kind of comment on, and I wasn't necessarily sure where you were headed. Yeah. But it's a beautiful thought about how do we restore our nations and our people. And I know sometimes when we're in our communities and we see a lot of tragedy around us, right? Like right now we're having an epidemic of the heroin problem, right? And I think that's one of those things that makes me feel most overwhelmed, right? We were just with some friends last week that had, 2 years ago, had lost their grandson and nephew, right, to heroin. Or we look at other kind of social problems that we have. We have a lot of health issues, right, related to our modern diets. And I think we could kind of despair at all the tragic things. And we could think, our languages are disappearing, our cultures are disappearing. These kind of colonial ways have overwhelmed us, right? And sometimes it feels overwhelming. But I think we also have to remember, I was just quoting the Dakota artist, Oscar Howe, to my students the other day. He was, we're doing an exhibit at the university on Dakota painters in 2024. And he was an artist that we always associate with South Dakota, although his family was from Minnesota, south of the Twin Cities, because those Indians after the 1862 war were sent to reservations, right? So we have Minneapolis and St. Paul and the displacement and the incarceration of Dakota people. So this whole real estate thing could happen in the place where we live in Minneapolis and St. Paul. But he talked about, he was rejected from an art show because his art wasn't Indian enough, because he was influenced by modernist painting that was going on in the mid-20th century. But he talked about in that letter, you know, how overwhelmed he feels, like the poverty of his father, his poverty of his family back at Crow Creek. And he said, you know, are Indian people supposed to live their futures in chains? You know, what is it? And even in the art world, can we be liberated? You know, how can I be rejected from an Indian art show? I'm an Indian person and this is my art. But he said how important it was, he called it, to keep to the fine ways. That's what he called Native culture. You know, remember, so he said, I try to keep to the fine ways. And I just think, what a beautiful expression that is. It's very simple. But I think that's what, when I go to a powwow today, right, and we take these incredible portraits of these women who've made these amazing dresses today. Some of them use them as protest at Standing Rock, or for missing and murdered women, or the I Don't Know More movement up in Canada. You know, they have a multi-dimensionality to it. But I think whatever we're doing now and the social issues that concern us, we do have to remember our fine ways and not forget that, because that's part of who we are too. And, you know, I always think how when I was in college and my grandma was still around when I was in graduate school, and I wrote my dissertation at the University of Iowa on Indian boarding schools. And I first learned about boarding schools from my grandmother, who had said, boarding school, you know, and I was like, what's boarding school? And she talked about what it was like to go away from Red Lake when she was a young woman and attend a government boarding school. And I think in a way, you know, I didn't appreciate everything about the elders and my grandmother, even when I was a young person, because you're trying to make your own way, right? You're trying to be your own unique person and go off. And, you know, I had a lot of, what would you say? I was very ambitious, not for success, but I was kind of like you, sort of ambitious for learning, right? But I think back now and I realized how much I learned from my family. And my grandmother, without her, I would never have written boarding school seasons. I wouldn't have written anything about the Jingle dress, right? So it's kind of a tribute to them, right? And that's kind of how I think of my work, because we were raised by some incredibly wonderful people. And so I think of my work as a historian, as kind of a tribute to them. This last year has been tough because we have lost some of our elders. And in Ojibwe country, we especially worried about our first speakers, right, of the language. And when one person dies, that's a whole archive, right? And so we're teaching new people to speak Ojibwe at the University of Minnesota, right, where we have a wonderful language program and kids are in immersion schools. But there's something so special about those people who grew up in households like my grandparents. My grandfather didn't speak English at all. And so there's something really wonderful about the older generations of people. But we just have to be our best selves, right, when they leave us, and carry on their work and think about what we learned from them. But I like your major. That sounds good too. Not everybody has to be a historian.
I might change my major now. Thank you.
Yeah, let's do. Thank you. And thank you for setting up.